There is a hole at the bottom of the map. The hole is not on the modern map. The hole is on the old map. The hole is on the map that was drawn in 1818 by a man named John Cleves Symmes Jr., who was, at the time, a former captain in the United States Army, and who proposed, in a paper he sent to the United States Congress, that the earth was not what the textbooks said. Symmes proposed that the earth was hollow. Symmes proposed that the earth had openings at both poles. Symmes proposed that the openings were, in his own words, large enough to admit a fleet of ships, and that, beyond the openings, there was an inner world, lit by an inner sun, populated by an inner people, who had, according to the legends that Symmes had been reading since he was a boy, been there for as long as the surface had been inhabited. Symmes was not, in the language of the United States Congress, taken seriously. Symmes was not, in the language of the United States Congress, taken seriously the way that a man is not taken seriously when he stands up in front of a room and says that the planet is hollow and the planet has a door. Symmes was invited to give a speech. The speech was entered into the congressional record. The speech was not, in the way that congressional records often are, forgotten. The speech was reprinted. The speech was reprinted in pamphlet form by the tens of thousands across the United States in the 1800s. The speech was, in the language of the pamphlets, a sensation. The hole on the map is the size of the Pacific Ocean. The hole on the map is a circle. The circle is labeled in a language that the modern map does not use. The label, translated, means approximately a place we do not go. In 1947, a United States Admiral named Richard E. Byrd, the man who had, in 1926, become the first person confirmed to have flown over the North Pole, returned from a flight. The flight, according to the press release, was a routine expedition. The flight, according to the press release, had surveyed 1,700 miles of previously unexplored territory beyond the pole. The press release was, in the language of press releases, unremarkable. The diary is not a press release. The diary is a document that surfaced on the internet decades after Byrd's death. The diary claims that the 1,700 miles were not, in fact, surveyed. The diary claims that the 1,700 miles were entered. The diary claims that the Admiral and his crew were taken by what the diary describes as flying machines of an unknown origin into a polar opening, and that, beyond the opening, there was a land that the diary describes, in language that is not the language of a Navy press release, as a warm, green, and unspoiled valley lit by a sun that was not the sun. The diary is, by every account that has ever been given, almost certainly a hoax. The diary is, in the language of the historians who have looked at it, the work of a Brazilian journalist named Paulo Strauss, who published it in Portuguese in the 1970s as fiction. The diary is, in the language of the people who have been reading it, in English on the internet for 30 years, a thing they would like to be true. The Admiral, in real life, never said this. The Admiral, in real life, died of heart failure in 1957, having been promoted in his final years to the rank of Rear Admiral. The Admiral, in the language of the conspiracy underground, was silenced. The Admiral, in the language of the historians, was a war hero. The diary is on the internet. The diary is in the pamphlets. The diary is in the late-night documentaries. The diary is, in the language of a great many people, the reason the question will not leave. The mythology of the inner world is older than the United States Congress. The mythology is older than John Cleves Symmes. The mythology is older than the Admiral. The mythology is, in the language of the Tibetan Bön tradition, older than recorded history. The Bön, who are the religious tradition that predated Buddhism in Tibet, tell of a place called Agartha. The place is below. The place is not, in the Bön text, a metaphor. The place is a kingdom. The place has a king. The king, in the Bön text, is the king of the world. The king of the world is not, in the Bön text, an evil figure. The king of the world is, in the Bön text, a being of extraordinary compassion who sits in a palace of crystal at the center of the inner world, and who, from that palace, watches with the patience of someone who has been watching for a long time the surface. The king of the world is waiting, the Bön say, for a particular moment. The moment is the moment when the surface has had enough. The king of the world will, at that moment, emerge. The mythology is not, in the language of the historians, unique to the Bön. The mythology is in the Hindu Puranas, in the form of a kingdom called Patala, populated by the Naga, a race of serpent beings. The mythology is in the Finnish epic, in the form of a place called Pohjola, in the cold north, beneath the polar ice. The mythology is in the myths of every continent that has had a mountain. The mountain in the myths is a door. The door in the myths has a guardian. The guardian in the myths has been waiting. The door on the map is the size of the Pacific Ocean. The door is at the pole. The door, in the language of the Bön, has a name. The name, translated, means approximately, a place we do not go. In 1938, the German government sent an expedition to Antarctica. The expedition was called Neuschwabenland. The expedition used a catapult ship, the MS Schwabenland, to fly aircraft over a section of the Antarctic coastline that the expedition named, in the German, Neuschwabenland, after the ship. The expedition surveyed, in the language of the official records, 200,000 square kilometers of previously unexplored coastline. The expedition returned. The expedition was, in the language of the official records, a survey. The expedition was, in the language of the conspiracy underground, the beginning of something else. The conspiracy is as follows. The conspiracy begins with a German occult society called the Thule Society. The Thule Society was, in the language of the historians who have studied it, an organization that was interested in, among other things, the mythology of a hollow earth. The Thule Society was, in the language of the people who have read the books that the Thule Society published, an organization that believed with the conviction of a religion that the inner world was real, and that the inner world was inhabited, and that the inner world was, in the language of the Thule Society, the origin of the Aryan race. The conspiracy continues with a thing called vril. The vril was, in the language of a novel called The Coming Race, written by the British author Edward Bulwer Lytton in 1871, a form of energy that powered an advanced civilization that lived, in the novel, beneath the surface of the earth. The WIIR was, in the language of the Thule Society, not fiction. The WIIR was, in the language of the Thule Society, a thing the Thule Society intended to find. The conspiracy, in the language of the historians, ends here. The historians note, correctly, that the Thule Society was disbanded in the early years of the Nazi Party. The historians note, correctly, that Bulwer Lytton was fiction. The historians note, correctly, that the expedition was, on the record, a survey. The expedition returned from Antarctica in 1939. The expedition was followed by 3 years by a war. The war, in the language of the conspiracy underground, ended. The conspiracy, in the language of the conspiracy underground, did not. The inside of the earth, in the language of the textbooks, is layered. The crust is thin. The mantle is hot. The outer core is liquid. The inner core is solid. The layers are, in the language of the textbooks, separated by seismic boundaries that we know about because of the way that earthquake waves bend when they hit them. The inside of the earth, in the language of the textbooks, is a layered sphere. The inside of the earth, in the language of the textbooks, has no inner sun. The inside of the earth, in the language of the conspiracy books, has an inner sun. The inner sun is small. The inner sun is, according to the conspiracy books, a star suspended at the center of the hollow earth, which is the size of the sun and which lights in a perpetual, fog-free, 12-hour cycle the inside of the inner world. The inner sun, in the language of the conspiracy books, is the reason the inner world is habitable. The inner sun is, in the language of the conspiracy books, the reason that the Admiral, in the diary that was almost certainly a hoax, described the inner world as warm, green, and lit by a sun that was not the sun. The inside of the earth, in the language of the physicists, cannot be hollow. The physics, the physicists say, requires that the inside of the earth be the layered sphere that the textbooks describe. The physics, the physicists say, requires that gravity pull matter toward the center. The physics, the physicists say, requires that the inside of the earth, if it were hollow, would not, on inspection, be a place where anything could live. The physics, in the language of the conspiracy books, is wrong. The physics, in the language of the conspiracy books, is the kind of physics that the surface uses to convince itself that the surface is alone. The physics, in the language of the conspiracy books, is the kind of physics that was wrong, the conspiracy books say, about the shape of the earth. For the entire time, the earth was flat. The math on the inside is wrong in the way that math is wrong when the math has been chosen by someone to make the inside of the planet look uninhabited from the outside. The hum is a name. The hum is the name for a low-frequency sound that has been reported in the language of the newspapers in cities as varied as Taos, New Mexico, and Bristol, England and Largs, Scotland, in the early 1990s, and in some places before. The hum is, in the language of the people who report it, a low vibration, often felt more than heard, that does not appear to be coming from any identifiable source. The hum is, in the language of the scientists who have studied it, almost certainly a phenomenon with multiple causes, ranging from tinnitus to industrial machinery to low-frequency noise from the ocean. The sky trumpets are another name. The sky trumpets are a different phenomenon. The sky trumpets are loud, sustained, metallic-sounding noises that have been recorded in the language of the internet, in cities and rural areas, in every continent except Antarctica, since at least 2011. The sky trumpets are, in the language of the scientists, almost certainly a phenomenon of unknown origin, possibly related to atmospheric acoustics, possibly related to industrial machinery, possibly related to something else. The something else, in the language of the conspiracy books, is the inner world. The something else, in the language of the conspiracy books, is the sound of the inner world leaking out through the polar openings, through the cracks in the polar ice, through the deep places where the surface is thin. The something else, in the language of the conspiracy books, is the sound of something large, something that has been down there for a long time, moving. The hum, in the language of the conspiracy books, is the sound of the inner world breathing. The sky trumpets, in the language of the conspiracy books, are the sound of the inner world trying to make itself heard above the surface, the way that a person trapped in a basement will eventually start to make noise. UFO reports at the poles are not, in the language of the historians, a new phenomenon. UFO reports at the poles are, in the language of the historians, a consistent pattern. Pilots, in the language of the pilots who have filed the reports, have described objects, lights, and shapes at both poles for as long as there have been pilots to fly to the poles. The pilots have described, in the language of the reports, objects that are larger than aircraft. The pilots have described, in the language of the reports, objects that move in ways that no aircraft is supposed to move. The pilots have described, in the language of a small but consistent subset of the reports, objects that are not, in the language of the reports, leaving. The objects, in the language of the reports that have been declassified, are going, in some cases, into the ice. The objects, in the language of the reports, are not, in the language of the radar operators who have watched the screens, coming back. The objects, in the language of the conspiracy books, are returning to where they came from. The objects, in the language of the conspiracy books, are going home. The objects, in the language of the pilots, are not, in the language of the pilots, manned. The objects, in the language of the pilots, do not, in the language of the pilots, have the markings of any known nation. The objects, in the language of the pilots, are entering the polar ice in places where, on inspection, the polar ice is, the conspiracy books say, thin. The places where the polar ice is thin, in the language of the conspiracy books, are the places where the polar openings are. The places where the polar openings are, in the language of the conspiracy books, are the places where the inner world is closest to the surface. The places where the inner world is closest to the surface, in the language of the conspiracy books, are the places where something has been, for a very long time, watching. The radar operator, in the language of the report, has logged the contact. The radar operator, in the language of the report, has been told, in the language of the report, not to log the contact. The question is not whether the inner world is real. The question, by now, is moot. The question is what it would change in the way you live if the inner world were. The question is whether the inner world, if it is the case, is something you would be able to detect by any method that did not itself require the cooperation of the inner world. The question is whether the things that have been, in the language of the reports going into the ice, are, in fact, the things that the conspiracy books have been saying they are for 150 years. The polar ice, in the language of the satellite images, is white. The polar ice, in the language of the satellite images, has been white on the public record for as long as there have been satellite images. The polar ice, in the language of the conspiracy books, has, on the classified record, a hole. The hole is, in the language of the conspiracy books, 2,000 miles wide. The hole is, in the language of the conspiracy books, not on inspection on the public record. The Admiral, in the diary, flew 1,700 miles inland. The Admiral, in the diary, came back. The Admiral, in the diary, was, in the language of the diary, told by the inner people not to come back. The Admiral, in the diary, came back. The Admiral, in the diary, died. The Admiral, in the diary, was, in the language of the conspiracy underground, silenced. The conspiracy underground is large. The conspiracy underground is, in the language of the people who have been reading it for a long time, the last place in the language where the question is allowed to be asked. The question is whether, in the language of the question, the door at the bottom of the map is a door. The question is whether, in the language of the question, the door has been, in the language of the question, opening. The question is whether, in the language of the question, you have, in the language of the question, been, in the language of the question, watched. We will be back tomorrow. New question, new answer. Subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss what comes next.